It turns out that children who heard a lot of fairy tales in their childhood are markedly better at handling conflicts later in life. And I think that's a very interesting point. Welcome to Season 2 of the Stories Café podcast, the espresso version of Stories Café, a brief, enriching pause for reflection on literature, cinema, archetypes, philosophy, and the art of living deliberately. I'm Annette Wernblad, course creator, internationally published author, and wanderer at heart. So cozy up and let's once again step into the world of stories and the deep ways in which they can shape the lives we live. How and why is it that fairy tales can transform our lives? So we can look at fairy tales obviously on different levels of meaning. One way of looking at Cinderella and Belle in Beauty and the Beast is saying, and this is the very sort of superficial reading, I like Belle personally because what she really longs for, what she really wants, is the content of the books. She loves the stories, obviously identify with that, and she wants adventure rather than a prince. And I think it is interesting that she is a revolutionary Disney fairy tale hero, in that she wants a life for herself. She wants the books. She wants the adventure. She's longing for that. Whereas in the previous stories, it was all about living happily ever after and meeting the right prince and all these things. But if you use that as a criticism of the other Disney heroines, that is a superficial way of looking at things. Because if you go just a tiny bit deeper and say, what could that symbolize, that the prince and the happy ever after? And one way of looking at, certainly in Jungian terms, is the unification of the feminine principle and the masculine principle, rather than just, women can't have a life of their own without a prince. It depends on how we analyze what those stories are about. And I'm usually not one for looking only at the surface layer and say that Belle is better because she's longing for the content of the books, whereas as Cinderella is longing for the prince, because it depends on how you interpret what the prince means. So what I actually want to focus on today is one of my all-time favorite books. I have this whole bookshelf behind me with books about stories and myths and archetypes and psychology and the psychology of stories and all that. And one of my favorite books is this book by Bruno Bettelheim called The Uses of Enchantment. So what he did was he talked about what is it that fairy tales do that can drastically change our lives, especially if we hear them in childhood, but also as adults. So he wrote this book about the theory behind that. What is it that fairy tales do? And then he did an analysis of a number of well-known fairy tales. And I love this book. I've read it many, many times. And one of his main arguments is, it turns out that children who heard a lot of fairy tales in their childhood are markedly better at handling conflicts later in life. And I think that's a very interesting point. And I'm going to read to you a couple of quotes today from Bruno Bettelheim's book that I think is so interesting. So just to answer that first question about fairy tales being able to transform our lives, somebody once said that the hooks of fairy tales go much deeper in us than the hooks of a realistic story. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes from Bettelheim's book, The Uses of Enchantment. In his introduction to the book, he says the following: "If we hope to live not just from moment to moment, but in true consciousness of our existence, then our greatest need and most difficult achievement is to finding meaning in our lives." That's right up my alley. That's what all my work is about. That's what the cafe is about. So I love that. Are we just living from moment to moment, or are we attempting to, what I call, live deliberately in true consciousness of our existence? Then what is our need? And here's then what he says: "The child finds this kind of meaning through fairy tales. Like many modern psychological insights, this was anticipated long ago by the poets. The German poet Schiller wrote, 'Deeper meaning resides in the fairy tales told to me in my childhood than in the truth that is taught by life.' And then Bettelheim continues, through the centuries, if not millennia, during which in their retelling, fairy tales became even more refined, they came to convey at the same time overt and covert meanings, which was what I was talking about before, to convey at the same time overt and covert meanings came to speak simultaneously to all levels of the human personality, communicating in a manner which reaches the uneducated mind of the child as well as that of the sophisticated adult. So if we look specifically at the two fairy tales I chose today, one of the things he says about Belle in Beauty and the Beast is that what she has to learn in her hero's journey, he doesn't use that word because Bettelheim is a Freudian, so I'm applying some of the more Jungian concepts to this, but what Bettelheim says is that Belle's main emotional connection is with her father. She's still living at home at a time where her sisters have already moved out, and she keeps saying that rather move out on her own and start her own, what Jung would call, individuation process for real, she prefers to live with her father. And then what Bettelheim says, just summing up, what Bettelheim says is that if at that age, if your main emotional connection to the opposite sex is with a parent, then by definition, sexuality is monstrous. And it's only when Belle learns, she's actually set free, she's kept captive in the castle of the Beast. It's only when she's set free and goes home to see her father, and then of her own free will chooses to abandon her father and go back to the Beast, that the curse is lifted and the Beast is transformed back into a prince, because now she's lifted her own curse of being so tightly connected emotionally to her father and living under the same roof. And one of Bettelheim's arguments, which I completely share in my work, is that children tend to understand these levels of meaning intuitively. It's only later when we start school and we're told that fairy tales are nonsense and Santa Claus doesn't exist and all these things, that we're sort of encouraged to bury that kind of knowledge under the floorboards. And one of my my main missions in life is to open that door to things we already knew so well when we were children, and to actually talk to children, if we have children in our lives, about how they experience these stories. And my experience, I used to teach these classes for grandparents and grandchildren, or parents and children, about the Harry Potter stories and about Lord of the Rings. And I was constantly, even though I know this and teach people this all the time, I was constantly bowled over by how wise the children were in the way they perceive these stories. And they intuitively know some of these things. They don't put it in those terms because they don't have a Freudian psychological training or anything like that, but they intuitively read these things, and it strengthens them in their journey through life. And so I'm going to finish by reading what he says about Cinderella, because that's such a brilliant illustration of what I'm talking about. So here's what he says. No other fairy tale renders as well as the Cinderella story the inner experiences of the young child in the throes of sibling rivalry, when he feels hopelessly outclassed by his brothers and sisters. Cinderella is pushed down and degraded by her stepsisters. Her interests are sacrificed to theirs by her stepmother. She's expected to do the dirtiest work, and although she performs it well, she receives no credit for it. Only more is demanded of her. This is how the child feels when devastated by the miseries of sibling rivalry. Exaggerated though Cinderella's tribulations and degradations may seem to the adult, the child carried away by sibling rivalry feels, that's me. That's how they mistreat me, or would want to. That's how little they think of me. And there are moments, often long periods, when for inner reasons a child feels this way, even when his position among his siblings may seem to give him no cause for it. When a story corresponds to how the child feels deep down, as no realistic narrative is likely to do, it attains an emotional quality of truth for the child. The events of Cinderella offer him vivid images that give bodies to his overwhelming but nevertheless often vague and nondescript emotions. So these episodes seem more convincing to him than his life experiences. And what Bettelheim is saying constantly between the lines is that without saying so, these stories give children, and as he said in the previous quote, actually also adults, tools to handle those things and even to feel that kind of identification. And if you're thinking about it, even the story of Harry Potter, when you see how the way that Harry Potter is mistreated by his uncle and aunt and his cousin, it's the same kind of knowledge and teaching that that story gives the child. Yeah, so that's why stories, fairy tales can transform our lives. Thank you so much for joining me. If this episode added value to your day, you're always welcome to return. You can follow the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts so that each new episode lands directly in your podcast app. And if you feel like leaving a review, it helps others to find their way here too. If you'd like to go deeper, you're warmly welcome inside Stories Café. Just go to stories-cafe.com, where you'll find further reflections, conversations, and a growing library of ideas. I'm looking forward to welcoming you back next time.